Welcome back to Radio Omnicor, the podcast where we explore the science of people, performance, and the workplace. I'm Colleen McClintock, your host, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Hilton Radnick. In today's episode, we're diving into a topic that's deeply relevant to the world of work right now: burnout, anxiety, and the mental load so many carry. Our guest is Dr. Colinda Linde, a clinical psychologist with more than 30 years of experience and a specialist in cognitive behavior therapy for anxiety, stress, and burnout. She's also the chairperson of SADAC and founder of the CBT group with a strong passion for making mental health tools more accessible to all. We'll explore how anxiety can hide in plain sight, what really drives burnout, and how leaders and organizations can respond in ways that are both compassionate and effective. Whether you're supporting a team, navigating your own challenges, or rethinking your approach to workplace well-being, there's something here for you. And now, here's our conversation with Dr. Colinda. Thank you, Colinda. It's so wonderful to have you in the studio with us. We're so thrilled to get the privilege to talk to you today. And Hilton, as always, as the co-host. Hi, Hilton.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here and talking about burnout.
So, Colinda, you have worked for decades in this space, the topic around anxiety, supporting individuals, and also helping people in the workplace, but also in your own private practice. What would you say is the thing that people get wrong about burnout? It feels like it's a very misunderstood topic. And maybe just to kick us off, what are the things that people assume incorrectly about burnout?
Well, firstly, thanks so much for inviting me for this topic. It's one of my favorites. And I think it's something we're hearing more and more about. And I really like your kickoff question. You're quite right that burnout, depression, fatigue, long COVID, they're all mushed together in one pot. So basically, you can think about burnout as a state of exhaustion on every level: physical, emotional, mental. And it comes because of a prolonged and excessive level of stress. And this is especially in the work context. So when we look at a differential between burnout and depression, we always look at, a psychiatrist once said this to me: are you happy to see your pets, or if you're old enough, your grandchildren? If you are, and your negative is only around work, then odds are it's burnout. If you're not happy to see anyone or anything and it pervades, then it's more depression. So I think that's actually quite a useful distinction. And when we look at burnout, there are the three core dimensions. So we know the Maslow burnout scale, and I think we've probably heard these three before. So the first one is the overwhelming exhaustion. So even if you have a week's holiday, a long weekend, within a day or two, you're back at work and you're exhausted. So that's often where people mix it up. Then the second one, and I've seen so many studies where they show that women tend to do this one, men tend not to, is where we feel ineffective. Am I still making a difference? What's the point? And then the third one that most guys go straight to is just that cynical, don't care, detached from everything. So men and women obviously can go through all three stages, but definitely women tend to get stuck in that, and I've seen this a lot in the medical field. Am I still making a difference? What's the point? Why did I study this? Okay, so that is burnout. Now, when it comes to stress, stress can be acute and it can be prolonged, but usually stress is attached to a certain demand. That there's a particular goal or there's a demand or a deadline. It tends to be more short-term, and then it's over. Okay, and that's usually to do with demands, resources. I don't have enough resources. And so when it's unrelenting and you don't have time to recover, that's when you're more likely to burn out. And then if we look at something like fatigue, so fatigue is a component of burnout, but you can still have motivation. So for example, you can be tired after a long day, but you still feel engaged, you still feel there's a purpose, and you still have a motivation and a connection to work. Whereas in burnout, all of it's missing. So burnout's the full house. I hope that makes sense.
It sounds a lot more complex than maybe we give it credit for, especially in the leadership space. I think people often say we're burned out, and we'll see that in engagement scores. But it seems like there's more elements to it that one needs to unpack.
Colinda, does burnout come gradually? Do you feel like it building, or is it you wake up one day and I've gone over some critical mess and now I'm burnt out? Like, how would you
Yes.
recognize it that I'm on the burnout journey?
That is, again, such a practical question. So burnout, it is exactly that there is a critical mass, but you don't often see it coming. So one of the very subtle symptoms in the beginning, and we can maybe talk about symptoms later because we obviously all do them differently, but one of the subtle ones is where you feel disengagement. So you yourself can start to feel disengagement. Remember those 3 dimensions. So the exhaustion, everybody's felt that before. But if you're feeling, I'm disengaging, I'm cynical, I don't care, that usually is a symptom. Just be careful about that one. And it's the lack of meaning and purpose with work. So that can be there for a long, long time. And then the obvious things, which are overwork, overcommitment, not delegating, perfection, those things. Yes, that doesn't help. But it's that disengagement. That for me is the pivotal factor. And then when that has been there for a period of time, and how long is a piece of string? It could be a few weeks, it could even be a year. Maybe it's also how desperate are you? Do you're a single parent, you have to work. And then it's exactly what you say, that so many of my clients will come up with something extreme. It'll be they're sitting in traffic and they pray that somebody will drive into them so they can actually have a legitimate reason to go and lie in hospital, or it's that extreme that when it goes over the edge, or they wake up and they just cannot actually go to work. That they're in their bed and they just have an absolute breakdown. It's, I cannot work. My brain is barren. I can't work. So that's usually how it happens. So it's kind of prolonged and then it seems like a critical mass. Yeah.
So what do we do as organizations? We can see the red flags. We can see things like people burning out, all these symptoms like feeling disengaged, not able to motivate or find the meaning and the purpose. And obviously leaders know their people well. They should know their people well, and you can start to notice these things. What is the correct support to give individuals who are seemingly on this burnout journey?
Knowledge is power. So I think if people are actually listening to a podcast, they can be thinking, well, where am I with those 3 core components? And especially if you're a manager, managers can help or hinder. So I would say step 1 is modeling. Kids do what we do, not what we say. And it's the same at work, that if your manager is saying, don't blur the boundaries, don't work evenings, etc., but the manager is doing that, it sets up a little bit of a contradiction. And then people might be feeling, well, they are, and they feel guilty because the manager's working, they're not. Or they feel that there's a veiled threat. Well, you're saying I must take the weekend off, but you're not. But then what if I lose my job because you think I'm not committed? So modeling. So talk is cheap, but we've got to start there. And I feel that systemically, I'm going to speak candidly, that from 2020 till about 2023, beginning of 23, I was overwhelmed by requests from corporates, especially, to come and educate people, train the managers, train staff on stress and burnout and depression and languishing and everything you can imagine in the mental health space. And then through 2023, something happened. Budgets were slashed and many jobs were on hold. I know that's part of it. Systemic factors happened. And it wasn't just me, because I asked around. And suddenly, people wanted us to get blood out of a stone. So they were wanting things on resilience and, just getting on with it, really. That was the mindset. Get on with it. We finished now with this mental health thing. Okay, we must be over it now. So I do believe that systemically, there's a big problem going on. I know Robert Reich talks about profit over people. I'm seeing it happen. I'm seeing many organizations where there's a freeze on hiring because profits weren't what they needed to be, no bonuses. I'm also seeing that initially people were consulted on the hybrid workplace, coming back to work and what would suit, etc. And that happened for about 6 months, and then just a blanket, you're coming back to work, finished. So I'm seeing a lot of systemic problems. And what happens there is that maybe you weren't spending an hour in the traffic and now you are. Maybe you were able to fetch your kids and then work in the evening, now you can't. So it's very much one size fits all. This is what we're doing. So there's not enough flexibility. There's very little autonomy. And there are more people doing way, way more without recognition. So these are just some of the factors. And it seems that corporates are not as interested in training their staff or their managers in mental health at the moment. So it's a bit of a tirade, but unfortunately it's what I'm seeing and it's what people around me are seeing.
Interesting. I mean, you're saying the workplace is essentially becoming more demanding. That
Yes.
that corporates are asking more of their people than they used to, which would kind of be a situational like component of burnout. I'm wondering if there's a equal dispositional one, like if you have some people who are just more prone to it, right? They're falling somewhere on the bell curve where, for whatever reasons, they just are going to be more subject to whatever's going on in the workplace and less resilient, I guess. Are those I mean, is it useful to look for those things when you're hiring? You want resilient staff who can deal with, I guess, reasonable demands. What would you be looking for in the hiring process that would, help you alert people to, maybe someone's vulnerability for burnout?
That is so interesting because, your high performers tend to mask when they're not doing well. So they present very well, they've got a good track record, they're conscientious, detail-oriented, all of those things. So obviously you'd want to hire that. But often those are the people who are going to burn out because they can't delegate. They want to be in control the whole time. And think of them as being very conscientious, that when they're stressed or things aren't going well, they will take on more responsibility. And that's the tricky thing, because normally you would hire for that, wouldn't you? You would want that, somebody with quite a good work ethic, etc. So I think if I had to answer that question, it would be around emotional intelligence. And for me, part of that is self-awareness, that you want somebody who's got a work ethic, but who isn't identifying their whole identity with work, because those are the ones who are going to burn out eventually. It will take long. And those are the people who will burn their staff out. You often see that, say somebody's single, no family, work is their partner, their child, their life. Of course, what's not to like on one level, but on the other hand, they're the ones who schedule meetings for 6 at night because they're not at home with the kids, or, on a Sunday evening because they don't have a partner. I've seen that many times. So it's very tricky because you'll get a lot out of them, but they will be very hard on the staff. So really what I'm saying is somebody who's got good EQ, who has an understanding of work-life balance, and somebody who has commitments beyond work, so that they have a family, they keep those commitments. There was a woman called Suzanne Kabasa in the late 60s, and she studied the Hardy personality. There were 3 C's that she actually identified as helping people to cope with stress very well. So the first was control. Now you can imagine in the late 60s, we didn't have the internet all over, so it was quite novel. So people who were realistic with their control appraisals. And then the next was challenge. Did they find the challenge when things were going wrong and manage to energize themselves? But the third was commitment. And that always surprised me. So these are people who had a spiritual commitment, they had a home commitment, they had an exercise commitment, self-care commitment, long before these things were fashionable. So if you were hiring now, I would look for somebody who had those 3 characteristics. And then a few years later, she added one, social support. Do they have it and do they use it? So you can see I'm really talking about quite a well-rounded person. So I wouldn't go for that extreme performer necessarily over a well-rounded person. And remember that if you're going to be a manager or a leader, you've got to inspire, you've got to know. It's almost like being a good parent. You know, when do I cut slack? When am I flexible? When do I wait for them to answer? When am I strict? So that's really what you're looking for, somebody who's balanced in that way.
So it's almost like there's a link probably between, if you take conscientiousness and extend it, you get perfectionism. So,
Yes.
perfectionistic people who have got unreasonable demands on themselves, the people around them who put in more work than is necessary. Is there literature on that? Do the perfectionists tend to have a higher burnout rate, or is there a link?
You know, I haven't seen literature specifically on that, maybe because I haven't looked, but you can think about it, that's somebody who drives themselves, somebody where they've got conditional worth. Look, we all have a bit of it, but if it's absolutely contingent on their work performance, I've seen that at the practice. So all I've got is 3 decades of the practice, really, and what people have told me. But I've seen that trend in men and women. I actually see it more in women, where it's very much, this is my identity. And if I should fail, then I'm lost. So I haven't seen any formal literature on that. What we have got in the literature is postnatal depression. That people who are extremely perfectionist high performers tend to be more prone to postnatal depression. So maybe there is a correlation there. I think there is.
Colinda, what does it take to recover? I've heard that once you hit burnout, the space of burnout, it's a long road to recovery.
Mm.
Is that true? And what are the steps one would need to take?
In an ideal situation, and these are the people who I've worked with over the years, if they're senior enough, they often get given 3 months off, no questions asked. The people who are not senior, they just have to try and make a plan. But usually people say middle and above, middle management and above. In an ideal setup, they take 3 months off and they're not allowed to engage work, and work's not allowed to engage them, which is not easy. But you can see it. Usually when we come to that point, they can rally for a couple of days just to hand over. But they're on their last legs usually by then and sliding into a depression. So month 1 is where you just rest. You actually rest. And everybody feels terribly guilty. But once they allow themselves in, they just sleep. And they're going for walks and they're outside in nature and they're not allowed to do any tasks. They're not allowed to do any thinking about what will happen in the future, where am I going to go. So I'm very, very strict and I check in on them. So month 1, you don't even have people coming to visit you from work because that can trigger you. So it's almost like you've got to be in cotton wool. And I liken it to somebody who's had, say, open heart surgery. For the first month, you're in ICU, then in high care, you're not having the whole world come in there, you're not having demands on you. So for month 1, it's almost like the old-fashioned convalescence where you'd be sent off to the seaside. Okay, wish we still had that after the flu, hey, 2 weeks of convalescence. Anyway, so it's 1 month. In the second month, they normally are a little bit more reachable and they haven't got that wide-eyed stare anymore. And in the second month, we start to look at the base. And then I would introduce things like exercise, maybe a little bit more family time, getting more involved in your life, the commitments part. But you're still not allowed to do work, okay, in month 2. So that is where maybe you would get 2 things in the house or, get your personal admin. But we want the brain still to be resting. Because think about burnout. Those neurons keep firing too much. They eventually burn out, don't they? And then towards the end of month 2, then we start with a cleaner, more energized mind to look at where does it go from here. And at that point, I'll then bring in the proper CBT, the cognitive behavior therapy, which will be exploring what are your beliefs, what got you in there, because it's pointless to do it in the first 2 months. The person's brain is not functioning. So in the third month, they've had a proper rest. And then it's very quick. It doesn't take long. That, okay, so your beliefs around work or your work ethic or self-care or leadership or your ambitions or asking for help. And then we explore that in the third month. And then at the end, we look at, do you need to pivot? How would you go back to work? Do you need to learn how to delegate? Do you need to learn good enough versus perfect? So that's where the big work happens. But in the first 2 months, it's really getting them, trying to almost force a recovery, getting them to shift from what got them into this mess in the first place. So if your car's engine seizes, it goes in, then it needs to cool off. Then you need to do your diagnostics. Then you take your time fixing. Then you do a test drive. Then you get back on the highway. So it's like that.
I mean, I would imagine there's probably quite a high relapse rate, right? Because whatever, you've taken your 3 months off, you've done whatever deep work there is, but then you're probably going back into a high stress environment, and you've still got all your your internal triggers, your years of habits and behaviors, all those kind of things. So I guess my question is, do you see a high relapse, or do most people, once they've gone through a process, able to moderate their lives and work in a different kind of mode?
I think it depends what your process is. So if you take off your 3 months and you don't really do much work, then you will relapse, probably. Very, very good chance, because you're back in the environment, all your old things get triggered, you probably will relapse. It is a novel approach that I use, where I make them go through each month, and I say it up front in a different way. Because if you're working them too hard, it's more of the same. Nothing has changed. So if we look at it in terms of first and second order change, first order, just put a Band-Aid, delegate a bit, okay, go back in. That's not going to work. So by the time we start that deep CBT, and we're doing intensive CBT in that last month, little bits of it already, just exploring, but when we get to that third month, we're ready. If you can get to somebody's core beliefs, and you can get to what I'd call second order change the operating system, then they are less likely to relapse. And then I don't just leave them, they have to come and report back after that. So if it's a severe case, it'll be every week for the first 6 weeks. If not, maybe every 2 weeks. But I keep an eye. And for a good year, eventually it's every quarter, I'll monitor. And the second I can see that it's slipping, I hope that they will see that it's slipping before I'm the one who has to verbalize. So I'm looking at that course correcting the whole time. But it is, as you say, you can't expect, 1 month, but it's actually a 3-month process. And you'd be surprised, I make them journal in the first month or 2, and you'd be surprised how much self-growth is actually happening. So by the time that they come to the third month, they actually have a lot of insights already. So they're ready. It's all the ingredients are assembled, and we just have to put the meal together. So the short answer would be, if they've done second order change, where they have, say, shifted the conditional worth, that actually I'm more than work, that kind of thing, then definitely the odds are very small that they'll relapse, because they'll go into the environment in another way.
I mean, it is quite a big ask for an organization to give someone that kind of time off, right? It's not, it
Yeah.
goes way beyond probably normal sick leave allocation. And then, like, I'm just thinking of our situation. If someone came back from that, although there may not be, I don't know, some kind of stigma around them, whatever it is, you would be quite cautious about the way you would maybe handle them. So there would be, a concern for their fragility. And I wonder if people report anything back to you about how, the organization's on a little bit of tenterhooks around
Mm.
the way they're working with them. I mean, have you seen anything
Yes.
like that?
Yes. And often I will ask to meet with people who are in the system, maybe the OD people or their boss, if possible. And sometimes the bosses are people who had burnout before, and they see it in their staff. They're 1 or 2 banks that I've had a long relationship with, where There's one particular person who sent me 4 people over the years after he recovered from his burnout. And he'll phone me up and he'll say, okay, this is another me. And then I know exactly. And they usually are quite senior, so they get their 3 months. And he keeps an eye. So, if you're lucky, the system works with you. But I think education, knowledge is power. So if I can, I will always try and to at least once engage the system that they're going back to. If I can't, I'll try and send a report or something like that, which we put together, and then that goes back. And usually when they do go back, in an ideal world, for the first months, it'll be a half day. And I'll always negotiate that if possible, which is rather they come in on a 50 to 60, but they're doing it well. And then the second month that they're back, they can be back to the usual. Now, you'd be surprised if they are in a crucial role or at a certain level and above, then it's wonderful, because then the organization knows that we have to do this so that this person can come back. And I often keep in touch, a year later, sometimes they pop in just to come and say hello, and this is how I am, and I'm still good. So I think if you've got the organization involved, yes, but if they're going back in and there is a lot of stigma attached, or if they go back prematurely, that's always a disaster. And this is especially in the case of what we said earlier, the conscientious person who is often prone to compassion fatigue. So they go back in, everyone freaks out, where were you? And they haven't been gone long enough that the system has actually functioned without them. And those people are very vulnerable. So that's definitely something we need to look at. Because if they're out for long enough, then they and the system realize, actually, we survived. We can do this. So it's very much system dependent and person dependent.
So I think to Hilton's point, not many organizations would be able to let somebody go for so long. And I think in South Africa, you don't have a choice. Many people don't have
Yeah,
a choice, right? They've got a job,
yeah,
they've got to hold on to it. And I
yeah.
think that kind of drives this whole thing about, I'm just going to fuss bait, I'm just going to hang in there. And then all of a sudden they
Mm.
can't anymore. So what does one do? What's the kind of light, the Colinda light for burnout? And maybe it's more preventive.
I think most people at the moment are in this extreme state of stress. I don't think people are thriving. I think they're surviving or coping, actually, if I look across the board. And I work with people all over the place, overseas as well. And this seems to be everywhere. I think it's the socio-political stuff going on and the cost of living. That is just hitting everybody. So you're right that everybody's under stress, but nobody can afford not to be working. So what I like to do with that is micro recovery. So that's really something you can do at any time. But the caveat is that at some point that critical mass is going to happen. And usually what I try and do with people is, how could you pivot? What is your bottom line? What do you need to earn? Is there another way that you could earn that? So that would be the longer term strategy, because some people, that is going to have to be where it goes. If you're lucky, you can maybe get a month off, or maybe even say 2 weeks if possible. It's better than nothing. Week 1, you would just absolutely sleep. And then week 2, we would try and just quickly do the micro strategies. So let's talk maybe about the micro strategies. So the first one is the breath. So one of my favorite things is to teach people how to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So the breath, you have it with you all the time. So really, it's the exhale that you've got to focus on. So we can even do one now. So whoever's listening, so breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds. So in, 1, 2, 3, 4, gently hold. Out through the mouth for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 3 or 4 of those. What it does is it drops the blood pressure, activates the vagus nerve, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. So just that, just focusing on a long exhale, you can do that anywhere, anytime. Another thing you can do to rest the neurons briefly, so whoever's listening is sitting, you would look around the room. So I've got a big window that I can look out of. So I'm looking at a bird walking over there. There's a little blossom, how interesting, because it's still winter. Looking at my desk, there's a glass of water. I can see some bubbles in there. Not sure what that's about. But does that make sense? That just at a sensory level, you could even feel it. You could see the bird and the bubbles, you know? So wherever you're sitting, there's always something. So it's giving you a micro rest from those neurons that are going the whole time. Interestingly enough, I've seen a lot of studies on exercise. Now, when you're tired, the last thing you feel like doing is exercise. But literally 10 to 20 minutes a day of getting your heart rate up. So if there's stairs at work, take the stairs. Don't take the lift. When you're standing there, you're going to be thinking, I don't want to be doing this. But you go up those stairs and you will feel different at the end. Sometimes even teaching people to do squats, 5 standing squats in your office, push-ups if you're able, jumping jacks, just little micro things like that. All of that helps. And then what a lot of the studies show is that if you want to get a quick and deep relaxation, if you have an alternate tense, relax kind of motion, that works very well. So I don't think it would be so easy to explain now, but just a quick version would be you would sit on your chair with your knees up, your hands behind your head, and then you would tense everything for 30 seconds. Squish up your face, tense your core, push back with your head, forward with your hands, your knees up, tensing everything for 30, and then an abrupt let go. We call it the flop. So it's that abrupt change from that tight to the flop. And so all of these little things, they're all hacks. So they all trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's really what you can do in the workplace. And then on the weekends, always try to get into nature as much as possible. Even 20 minutes would be fine. And then those commitments that I spoke about earlier, just make sure that you have other micro ones. Even if it's you can't get yourself out the house, but it's, okay, I'll repack this cupboard, or I will spend 5 minutes in the garden with the dogs or the kids or whoever, or if you're on your own, just in the garden. So little micro things, 2 to 5 minutes, they're very, very valuable, and we can all do that. So these are just some examples of micro recoveries.
And those are accessible, and they're not going to cost you a
Yeah.
whole lot of money. They just
Yeah.
find ways to make it doable that you can implement.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Because
There's one other one. Sorry, just before we move forward, acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness. Those are also quite useful. So mindfulness is just being, present in the moment. But one of the acceptance commitment techniques that I like a lot is cognitive diffusion, where you basically, you detach mentally. So you say, I notice myself feeling this feeling. I notice myself feeling an overwhelm. So just that, I notice myself feeling or doing or wanting to scream at this person. I notice myself doing whatever. It just helps in the moment. Had to add that one.
It's like where you become an observer
Yes.
of all the
Yes.
noise in your head
Yeah.
and just kind of,
Yeah.
it's very common for organizations to run engagement surveys, and it's fascinating to hear this connection between disengagement and burnout. And one of the things we've noticed is that some of the people who are lowest on their scores of disengagement are people who feel bullied in the organization. They feel they have, either colleagues or a manager who's, on their case the whole time. They, again, feel under pressure all the time and, a loss of effectiveness because they're always getting corrected. Have you noticed anything? Well, I don't know. Is there some kind of link between burnout and just bad managers?
Well, if you go back to burnout, what it is, there's the exhaustion, and then there's that feeling of, am I being effective? And I think that's often where you can get hit. So the exhaustion could be unrealistic expectations, where there's no work-life balance, there's a blurring of the boundaries, that kind of thing. Or if there are unclear expectations around, well, this is what success would look like. So then that leads to exhaustion because you're just trying. Well, okay, do you want this? Do you want this? And then the second one where people are second guessing themselves, I think definitely there's a link there, because often bullies are not those in your face people, are they? You know, it can be very snide or very subtle or just an eyebrow raised or a little comment about you. So I think that's where that one hits. And then the disengagement at the end, that's cynical. I think by the time you get there, you just don't care anymore. But that's often where you can slip into a depression. So I think part of it is the lack of recognition and, of course, the unrealistic expectation. But recognition, you know, it's sort of hard to just take a second to recognize someone, especially if they did something beyond the call of duty. But I think the problem is that, you know, everybody's supposed to work 12 hours or 15 hours a day now. So there's no recognition. And that's just where it's gone all horribly wrong. And then the other one is autonomy. So I'm sure you've heard this before with the flow research, where work, you actually have double the flow experiences than you do anywhere else. But then why do we all want to get to Friday? And what emerged is because it's a lack of autonomy and it's a perception that I have no autonomy. But often if managers are either draconian, it's this way, and that they're not flexible enough, in fact, that's stupid management, because often the people around you will have a more efficient idea. But if there's absolutely no autonomy and it's just this pressure top down, you can see how that's going to lead to burnout. And so disengagement is that third one, you know, where people are just finished. They just don't care anymore.
Colinda, I want to talk a bit more about the amazing work that you do with SADC and what you see showing up there, especially for the Gen Z, you know, group, because they seem to be also hard hit with burnout. Is that due to potentially not having as much resilience or resources, or do you notice anything from your research? I know you always do good annual research.
Mm, mm. And, you know, one of the things that was terrifying was when they looked at how many psychologists and how many psychiatrists are left. And there were 780 psychiatrists, 3,000 psychs, and we have 60 million people. So this is a problem. So if we look at the stats that 1 in 3 is struggling with mental health, that's 20 million people. And then these are the resources we have. So this is a problem. And we also know that the government spends 5% of the health budget on mental health, which is, again, horrendous. I mean, at the end of the day, it should be 50-50. And so what we are seeing is that the depression is definitely going up in men, and suicide rates are going up, especially in younger men. If I remember correctly, it was between 16 and 25. Those suicide rates have gone up a lot. Now, is it because it's being reported more, or is it because it's happening more? I don't know. But there is another stat that I can share. So we have board meetings 4 or 5 times a year. And I remember clearly before lockdown, we had a board meeting and somehow we were looking at the numbers and it was, they had 600 calls or WhatsApps per day at SADC. And I said, is that per month or week? No, per day. Okay, we had 16 phone lines, but they're open 24/7, but still. And after lockdown, it was 1,200, which was scary, but I understand. You know, around the world, I'm part of the APA and other organizations. We saw it everywhere. That anxiety and depression went up. Okay, we got that. By the end of the year, it was still that. And a year later, it's still on 2,400. So from 2022 till now, 2,400 calls or WhatsApps or emails per day, which is mind-blowing. We've got 32 phone lines active at any time. We have corporate helplines, you know, many, many lines, but 2,400 per day, and it's not coming down. So it really is looking rough. And we have a program called Scouts that goes into the schools. So they do suicide prevention, and they're a big group of them. So somebody's doing a talk in the front, and then the others are just watching, you know, who needs the individual input. So we're looking at it in a more preventative way, because by the time that you get to your 20s, it's a little bit harder. So we're going into from about late primary school to sort of grade 11, and there are many suicides going on. The youngest was 9 at a school at 9 years old. That's a terrible record to have. So so this is helping. We're getting very good feedback, and we are seeing that it is younger people who are calling in, and then there are people who are losing their jobs who are calling in as well, where they're single parents. Now they're the one who runs the family. So there's a lot of that. So it looks more like depression than anything else, but there is a lot of anxiety, panic, stress, burnout. It's really increased.
I wonder what role technology is playing in this whole thing. And, like if I think of all the tools we use, they to make us more efficient. And they make us more efficient because there's more demand and higher expectation of delivery. And even if you take something like, AI, and, there's a sense that people should use AI to, be able to do some of the work for them, get things out quicker, delivery faster. And if the cadence of the world with all the technological tools that we're using isn't in somehow just exacerbating the demand that we deliver more in a shorter time at a faster pace, and that's just this kind of velocity.
I remember when cell phones first came, I was an early adopter because I loved tech in all forms, maybe less now. And when I could get my emails and messages, and you could make a phone call, who even does that anymore, on my phone, I loved it for a while. And then I didn't, because remember snail mail, your letters in the post, or, you've got to wait for that thing to be delivered. We had to learn to wait, didn't we? So I do think that life was a more comfortable pace. I don't think at a genetic level we have evolved as quickly as tech has. If you, I did genetics undergrad, and it's amazing how that has helped me since then. If we look at, it takes several hundred years for genes to change. I could give some examples, maybe just one. So if you look at African people, as in, on the plains of Africa, there's a particular gene that has sickle cell anemia on it. And obviously that wouldn't be great. And this particular gene, if you have anemia, well, if you're eating a lot of meat and so on, it's not the end of the world. And that very same gene is also an anti-malaria gene. So obviously you need that gene because there's malaria all over. And the people who are in the US, who've been there for a number of years, obviously didn't go voluntarily, but the people there, that you would think they don't need a malaria gene, and actually having a sickle cell anemia gene would not be good, because a lot of the people are in neighborhoods where there are a lot of stabbings and things like that, because that is where they ended up, some people. But the concentration is identical. So as many people of the population who have that amount of genes here are the same in the US. Now, they've been there for a long time. Surely by now the genetics would have changed. No, they haven't. And so how long have we had tech? Not that long, a few decades. So you would think that the brain's going to take a long time. And I do see studies now, for young ones, thumbs are different and all of that. Yeah, maybe. But what about our brains? So our brains are being shaped all the time, but it's gone too quickly, way too quickly. And I think that's where the problem is coming in. And even generationally, if I get a new phone, my kids set it up. The other day, I asked my daughter something, and before I'd even really got my phone to look it up, she said, there's the answer. She'd looked it up while talking to me while walking. What? So my brain hasn't adjusted to that yet. And I don't think our brains are meant to be on all the time. So go back to industrialization. A lot of sleep problems since then, because we used to stop when the sun stopped. Now we don't. So I see a lot of people who've got the most appalling sleep habits, sometimes me too, but because we can. I get up at 1 a.m, okay, my phone's there. I'll do some work or I'll do something. So 100% to your point. So I love AI and I love tech, but I also hate it. And I think it's not,
Mm.
tech in itself is not good or bad. It's what we do with it. Human nature.
And it sounds like it would be beneficial for most people to take some kind of break from their technology on a regular basis. Have a day a week where you switch off, where you're not, responding to the demands of your email, your phone, your social media, to everything that's going on, and just get away from that every now and again.
A day a week, I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe an hour a day is more likely, or one day in a weekend or something. How are you going to
We
order
have to
your
be
Uber Eats?
intentional. Yeah.
So, but I think you're right. You're right. We do need to take
Mm.
breaks and just get back to actually using our brains. I'll Google it. When did Google become a verb? So yeah, we could rant all day, but we're not going to do that.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, I would love to just building on this, and I would imagine this is our final question, if you can believe it. So, with remote working, you're in these team calls from morning until night. So, is there something there that's impacting our sympathetic nervous system? Is making us maybe with raised cortisol levels? You're just on screen, going from meeting to meeting. You don't even walk from a room into another
Yes.
room. You just dial into the next meeting, and that intensity seems to add a whole level of stress.
Very much so. Imagine if we drove our cars, or well, let's start there. If we drove our cars like we drive ourselves, I mean, they all break down. They'd run out of fuel. Imagine if it wasn't allowed to idle when it got to the red light. You had to rev it the whole time. And think about any machine. Think of your phone. It goes into hibernate. Why? To save fuel, electricity, or battery. So we don't do that for ourselves. It's a big problem. So what I'm seeing is that the manager needs to lead by example. And if a manager has a little bit of autonomy, what I'm seeing, which is quite a pleasing trend, is that there are certain organizations where no meeting may last longer than 30 minutes, which I think is good. It's harder to stack 30, 30, 30, 30, where an hour is easier. So no meeting may last longer than 30, or if it's going to be an hour, it can actually only be 50 minutes. So you've got a little toilet break, tea break, breathing break. And if you are not in one of those, unfortunately, then I recommend that everybody builds in a 2-minute break at the end of that hour. So if you look at the studies, Tony Buzan in the 70s was the first who spoke about this. After 50 minutes, your brain's done. It now wants to archive what you've been doing, but then you're putting in your next inputs. So 50 minutes, if you think about the therapy session, traditionally it's 50 minutes, isn't it? So that the therapist has the 10 minutes, the person can leave, they can kind of reset. So I think nowadays it's not always so easy. So I can maybe do 3 back to back in a row, but then I will take a half-hour break, always, always, even if I think I don't need to. So we need to try and build those in, and we can even do it in our own diaries. I put things in my diary. My staff know I'm taking a break. Don't ever put something in there, and because I won't do it. And I think that I had to discipline me to do that. It's a half-hour break because I know if it's an hour, well, I might just put someone in there. So you've got to work with yourself. But, even if where you work is completely not for this, you can try and sneakily, every 2 hours minimum, have a 2-minute break, 5-minute break, and try and involve moving and nature. Even if you're looking at pictures of nature, green for some reason. I've seen a very nice set of studies on that green actually just does something for the parasympathetic, and then keep hydrated, we know that. But try and move, even if you're walking around the table or you move your laptop to another angle. So those are just little micro things we can try. I'm very passionate. You asked me one question and I could talk for an hour on each of them. They've been such good questions.
It's inspiring, and I think it's also quite confronting because as a manager in an environment, a consulting environment, and it's a small team that I lead, we're falling into a lot of these issues, and I need to make those changes. I'm the leader who's not role modeling the best practices. So, but luckily at Omnicor, we have autonomy and freedom to make those changes. And it's been inspiring just to hear you, when you put those basic things in place, then you can prevent, hopefully, this overwhelm and burnout and stress. But it's changing the behaviors as a collective and as a system. Yeah.
But you can start at any time. Obviously, prevention is better than cure. But even if you change one thing by 1% every day, 100 days, you've changed that thing. So these micro changes are actually going to be what causes the big change. Think about a bucket when you've got a leak in your house. You think, oh, it'll take hours to fill, and then suddenly it is. Well, we can do that in a good way. One micro boundary or micro self-care, micro recovery does work.
Great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Colinda. Any closing comments, Hilton?
No, thanks. I think definitely, people have to take this seriously. And I think as leaders in an organization, we have to be protective of our staff and, put the right things in place. So thanks for all the guidance, Colinda.
Well, it's all about modeling. So thanks for doing this. I think this topic needs to be looked at again and again and again because it's the one thing that's getting worse all the time. Anxiety, depression, yes, they're bad, but they've more or less stabilized. Stress and burnout, going up, not in a good way. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Colinda. That's it for this episode of Radio Omnicor. A huge thank you to Dr. Colinda for her calm, clear insights into how we can better navigate burnout, stress, and workplace anxieties. From unpacking the difference between stress and burnout to identifying what organizations can change, Colinda reminded us that it's not just an individual issue. Culture, leadership, and systems all matter. Colinda shared some beautiful reminders that even small shifts can make a difference. And of course, a big thanks to our producer, Siad Lamini, for bringing this conversation to life. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a friend, subscribe, or leave us a review. I'm Colleen McClintock, and this has been Radio Omnicor. Take care of yourself and each other.